Ich habe jetzt die Freude, noch unseren letzten Gast vorzustellen. Freut mich, dass er da ist. Shuddhabrata Sengupta, wahnsinnig schwierig auszusprechen. Shuddha selber ist Schreiber, ist Filmemacher, ist Medienkünstler. Er ist Teil eines sehr, sehr bekannten Kollektivs, Rax Media, die sehr stark in Richtung ästhetische, künstlerische Forschung, Urbanismus, Cyberkulturen arbeiten. Rax Media war auf jeder großen oder größeren Ausstellung schon vertreten, von der Documenta über die Istanbul Biennale, die Biennale von Venedig. Das Kollektiv selbst hat auch selber kuratiert bei der Manifesta 7 in Bozen, und die Gruppe hat eine Plattform in Delhi, wo sie beheimatet sind, aufgebaut, Sarai, wo sie sich zusammen mit Wissenschaftlern über die kulturelle und die urbanen Entwicklungen in Südasien sehr intensiv beschäftigen und auch eine periodische Zeitschrift herausgeben. Shuddha, I'm happy that you are here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sigrid, and thank you for inviting me for Social Fictions to speak to you today. I normally inhabit the province of contemporary art, so it's quite interesting to make these little interlopery moves into the world of the performing arts, into theatre. But it's of recently my collective, Rax Media Collective, we've been exploring theatre a little bit, exploring conversations with theatre practitioners. And today, what I'm going to do today with you is to talk about a register of thinking about the archive as if it were theatre. And it follows from that to present a little bit about work that we've been doing, where archival material has been transformed into theatrical text by us in collaboration with the theatre practice of Zulekha Chaudhry, a director based in Delhi. So this is called Theatre in the Archive in Theatre, the work of contemporary art in theatre and the photographic archive. The camera is witness and actor. The arts and sciences of memory changed the moment photography entered our consciousness. Until that time, it was possible to dispute whether or not an event had occurred. After photography, that debate is no longer possible to frame in those terms. The question is no longer about whether something did or did not occur. The question is, was there a camera on hand to show us whether or not it did occur? So, of course, even here, we have two cameras. If there was not a recording of this event, we would not know whether this event was an event in the archive. And our conversation today is already making its way into some archive. And possibly a distributed archive, maybe you will release some of it on YouTube. It will find its way into the world as a different kind of archival trace. It will be an actor in the world. You know, when Hannah Arendt talks about acts, she talks about insertions into the world as ways of doing things that have not been done before, and each act carries with it its certain velocity, its certain value. So this conversation, in that sense, also becomes an act. This is a stage. I am an actor. You're spectators. The camera is both witness and actor. Photography, especially in the archive, is a form of theatre. As in any performative genre, photography occasionally demands a degree of the suspension of disbelief. We are not asked to simply see, but also to believe that we are seeing. The photographic historian and archivist John Schwartz writes, "Photography was not just a new way of seeing, it was a new way of believing. It was a technology of trust, or what record keepers would consider a trustworthy information system. And yet, the rhetoric of transparency and truth,
or in archival terms, authenticity, reliability, and objectivity, that came to surround the photograph raised serious questions about the very nature of truth, particularly in relation to art. At the surface of the problem was the degree to which a mechanical device could produce a truthful picture of reality. And there are two problems here. On the one hand, the camera is a mechanical device. It must be seeing an objective reality. On the other hand, can a mechanical device allow us to understand something that we call truth? Those of who are from the theater knows that the truth of the actor is something that the actor produces together with the audience. It is a very different, it is of a very different quality from the truth of the mechanical device of the photograph. Both, we could argue, are claims to truth of different kinds. Following from this, we could say that photographs are not traces of truth per se, because they are themselves implicated in the production of what we have come to be known to be true. It is in this vein that John Tagg, in his influential book on history and photography, The Burden of Representation, says, photographs are never evidence of history, they are themselves the historical. Or in other words, the real. They are effects to be produced rather than facts to be understood. What makes history is not necessarily what gets historicized. The archival photograph is a two-legged beast. It both makes history in the sense that it constitutes historical evidence for us, and at the same time, it also unmakes history because it excludes that which falls outside its frame and the time it took to make the measure that resulted in the photograph. The archival photograph contains both the presence as well as the absence of the historical within its surface. Reading the photograph, then, is to read all the things it says, and at least into some of the things it does not say. Listening to its silences is an act of imagination. It is here that the artist is able to do a few things that the historian is inhibited from doing. These are two photographs in the British Library of the natives of the Andaman Islands who were meticulously and rigorously photographed. In some cases, we could say photographed to death, such that there are now more photographs of the Andamanese than there are Andamanese themselves. And here, the photograph both excludes as well as includes something. It excludes the fact that these people were asked to strip naked in order to be photographed so as to be represented in what the photographers, which were the colonial administrators, thought to be their original native state. So outside the frame of this picture, where that hand is at the bottom right corner, which keeps the photograph, the grid in place, there is also a pile of clothes. The photograph is a measure both of what is left behind as well as what is included. And as you can see, because these are old photographs, they need to be stabilized. The human figures need to be stabilized, and that is why there are these elaborate anthropometric apparatuses which keep the body in frame in question. How do we relate this question of the active production of a sense of the real to the practice of contemporary art? Art, as we know it, does not show reality, it produces truth. The truths produced by art are not necessarily mimetic, nor do they lay claim to comprehensiveness or completeness. But the succor that art brings to the senses have something to do with the sense of the repleteness of an experience, even when that experience is presented to us elliptically, enigmatically, and with an acute awareness of the absence of the empirical datum. So my presentation of these photographs today constitutes a very different register of feeling even than the intention with which these photographs are taken. And their presence in this presentation, their presence as actors in the theater that we construct between us today, has also a very different valence. What does a photographic archive do to an artist when he or she enters the archive? What does the artist make of the accumulation of history that the archive presents? In some senses, the question of the performance of the ontological status of the photographic trace in an archive is made most apparent when contemporary art meets the archival photograph. Derrida writes in Archive Fever, the archive as printing, as writing, prosthesis, or Hypermnestic technique in general is not only the stockroom and the conservatory for archivable contents of the past, which would exist in any case and just the same without the archive. No, the technical structure of the archiving archive also determines the structure of the archivable contents, even as it comes into existence and its relationship to the future. So the archive is like a stage set, and the archivables in them become like the actors in that stage set. The archive shapes facts. It produces the narrative and the story and the facts that are made to tell. In other words, the archive, by its sequential, cross-indexed, and jussive orderings of notings and data, can also render a figment of the imagination into a fact, or at least blur the borders of fact and fiction. One possible task for the artist in the archive, then, is to prize the archived fact back into the realm of interpretation. Through hermeneutic procedures that privilege the imagination, it is to ask what gets forgotten or what can only be recovered through fantasy, through speculation, through the oddness, humor, and irony, wherever the archive produces its fixity of memory.
Faces light up like coal in a brazier, ablaze, radiant, pensive, troubled, hungry, calm, assured, insane, inflamed. Piling eye upon eye, ear upon ear, wrinkle upon wrinkle, feature upon feature, smile upon grimace. Francis Galton, mathematician, statistician, polymath, and Victorian colossus, wants to see his picture of the world when he looks at a crowd of faces. His world is small, his laboratory crowded. His assistants are tired, their calipers are falling apart. They have never measured so many in so little time. When he files away thousands of faces or fingerprints into numbered and indexed folios, he isn't just creating a repository of physiognomies. He is collecting and classifying the content of souls, turning, he thinks, the keys to the mysteries of the locked cabinet of human character. But the ghost image of a composite of madmen from Bedlam has strangely gentle eyes. Galton's wager that if you were to stick the faces of 87 inmates of the Bedlam Asylum on top of each other, you could end up looking into the eyes of madness, has gone oddly awry. Criminal composites produce a saintly icon. A quest for the precise index of what Galton thinks is ugliness in a row of sullen East London Jewish schoolboys yields amazing grace.
This extract from The Surface of Each Day is a Different Planet, a video installation by us that considers, among other things, the dense presence of human beings in archival faces. We find ourselves in it, through it, face to face, with this haunting archive of faces in the Francis Galton collection in the Science Library of the University College of London. That encounter finds its way into this text spoken in the work that you just heard. The silence of hundreds of faces begins to yield. Later on in this piece, we invoke and quote Francis Galton, and he says, "The individual photographs were taken with hardly any selection from amongst the boys in the Jews' free school Bell Lane. They were the children of poor parents. As I drove to the school through the adjacent Jewish quarter, the expression of the people that struck me was their cold, scanning gaze. And this was equally characteristic of the schoolboys. So the cold, scanning gaze of the boys met the cold, scanning gaze of Francis Galton. And the photographs are a result of these two encounters. The compositions were made with a camera that had numerous adjustments, he goes on to write, for varying the position and scale of the individual portraits with reference to fixed fiduciary lines. So each of those faces that you saw were actually composites made up of about 80 faces. So those faces are layer upon layer, they're kind of average of the human face. But so beautiful the results of these adjustments are, if I were to begin entirely afresh, I should discard them and should proceed in quite a different way. This cannot be described intelligibly and at the same time briefly. The faces and fingerprints that Galton was obsessed with whisper 1,000 secrets to him, but they do not let him in on their greatest mystery. The face of the crowd is a face in the crowd, fleeting, slippery, gone before you blink, always gentle, always calm, always someone you think you can recognize but can never recall. The archive shapes facts. It produces the narrative and the story that the facts are made to tell. These are pictures from 1857, from the rebellion in the army of the East India Company, which produced a horrific war throughout much of the northern part of India and Pakistan. And these are some of the earliest photographs taken of human bodies in conflict. So the archive produces the narrative and the story that the facts are made to tell. In other words, the archive, by its sequential, cross-indexed, and jussive orderings of notings and data, can also render a figment of the imagination into a fact, or at least blur the borders of fact and fiction. So these portraits of the captured rebels and the hanged rebels begin to be sort of characters in the story of 1857. One possible task for the artist in the archive, then, is to prize the archived fact back into the realm of interpretation through hermeneutic processes that privilege the imagination. It is to ask what gets forgotten or what can only be recovered through fantasy, through speculation, through the oddness, humor, and irony, and tragedy whenever the archive produces its fixity of memory. So the tradition of the photograph of the dead rebel continues with this kind of genre photograph which you see a lot in Indian newspapers and television, which is of dead rebels from Kashmir. And they're often photographed with as trophies by the army when it kills them. The drama of the photograph in the archive consists in this tension between the claim to truth and the ruses necessary to the making and contestation of this claim. This fact has come alive to us most recently while working with a remarkable photograph, seen at Sikandrabad, currently in the collection of the Al-Qazi Foundation for Photography in New Delhi. The photograph was taken in 1858 by the itinerant photographer Felice Beato as part of an album of scenes related to the mutiny of 1857 and produced a sustained reflection that constitute a significant section of the work that we've already referred to. The surface of each day is a different planet, and now the theatrical production seen at Sikandrabad. Bones. Seen at Sikandrabad, Lucknow, 1858. Sikandrabad is a relatively small, walled pleasure garden on the eastern outskirts of the North Indian city of Lucknow. During the siege of Lucknow in the war referred to as the Mutiny of 1857 by the forces of the British East India Company in India, Sikandrabad became a site for some of the fiercest fighting. An image by the itinerant photographer Felice Beato, whose sojourn in India is bracketed by stints in the Crimean War and the Second Opium War, shows the pavilion within the gardens where, as Beato's own caption dispassionately recalls for us, 2,000 Indians were mercilessly slaughtered in November 1857 by the 93rd Highlanders of the 4th Punjab Regiment in the course of the attack led by Sir Colin Campbell.
This photograph is taken in March 1858, roughly 4 months after the actual fighting at the site took place. At first glance, the picture suggests a sentimental melancholia, stately nostalgia for a time gone by, or the fleeting resonance of an arrested time, a baroque ruin, men in studied poses, a fine horse. But then our eyes begin to work and travel. The photograph seems to have been taken in the clear light of day, perhaps at noon. There are no shadows to obscure the fact that the scene is the result of a careful act of arrangement. The skeletons are clean, picked to the bone, white against the dun earth, as they would be in a painterly tableau. We know something about the relative rate of decomposition of cadavers and the time it takes for a body to be reduced completely to a bare skeleton between the November and March of a North Indian winter. If the bodies were of the rebels of the mutiny of 1857, they could not have become so clean so soon. Had they been picked clean by scavenging animals from shallow graves, they would not have remained so well integrated as skeletons. It is possible, in fact highly likely, that they may not have been the bones of the dead rebels slaughtered at Sengupta at all, but props, macabre prosthetic additions, other people's bones, brought in to set the scene because the originals are missing or just not good enough for a decent picture. The bones, whosoever they may in fact have belonged to, have been placed with thought to symmetry and order, just as the carefully held attributes of the men suggest the exact degree of forethought necessary to create the illusion of spontaneity. If each of the 206 bones of the adult human body could speak, they would all sing the body's praises. Ossuaries would be operas. The sternum or the breastbone would testify to its owner's pride. The ribs would act as a sentimental chorus, singing an elegy to the fluttering heartbird. The fibula, tibia, and femur would drum up anthems to strength and vigor. The tarsals and metatarsals, carpals and metacarpals, radius and ulna would praise poise and dexterity. The coccyx would hit a bass complaining note. The frontal bone of the cranium would worry. Bones of every function and description would whisper, scream, speak in tongues and measured tones, laugh, cry, sing in tune, off-key and off-kilter. Only the lonesome hyoid, the unarticulated bone of the tongue, might choose silence in jest at the excess of cadaverous cacophony. The hyoid would hold its tongue, knowing that every life is deserving of only as much noise or silence as every other life.
The hyoid would hold its tongue. But this refusal to be eloquent, this insistence on the muteness of one death or any other death, is also what leads us to an exploration of the mute body, the body against the photograph. Working with images today is working with an ever-expanding archive of pictures that grows around us by the second. Going back to an archival photograph from 1858 is in a sense reminding ourselves of the origins of the photographic moment. And here I will now show to you images from the theater production that actually constitutes the second iteration of this photograph's life in our artistic practice. These are images from scenes from Sengupta, the theater production that opened in the Kunsten Festival in Brussels, and then again in Paris in the Festival of Autumn. The foggy screen that you see is actually that photograph the photograph from 1858, in formation as the actor produces a series of moves, performs texts, produces silence and markings against the gradual revelation of the photograph itself. Working with images today is working with an ever-expanding archive of pictures that grows around us by the second. Some photographs hang on walls, some become monumental icons, some get lost in folders and files and filing cabinets, others are worn as pendants, some end up in gravestones, others end up in the garbage. Probably most get sent into a photographic digital limbo, when probably 1 million times each second the delete button is pressed on a digital camera. Wherever they are found, and howsoever they circulate, the photograph indexes distance and proximity, intimacy and difference. It tells us instantly stories about comfort and discomfort, and whether or not the presence of the photographer in a given situation was welcomed, challenged, ignored, or merely entertained. Our understanding of the photographic archive of the past and the contemporary practices of photography infect each other. The moment of taking a photograph today and the moment of looking at a photograph taken in the past produces a similar field of forces that gets activated in the interval between the click of a shutter in a camera and the filing of a photograph in a hard drive or an archive. Between these two instants lies an entire history of the performance of a claimed truth. The photograph is a chronicle of that history, and our role as artists today is not to repeat that claim, but to subject it to an imaginative trial. That is what has made us move from the archive to the theater with the photograph as our guide. Thank you. Show you some more.
Okay. And thank you, Shuddha, for that very rich speculation on the journey of the photographic moment, both in terms of its material presence and its claims, its truth claims. And I wonder if the archive, in the way you imagine it, can move so seamlessly from the kind of dusty, or in many cases it's no longer, the archive is no longer this dusty reminders of the past, but something that is very active, deeply interpolated with the present itself. But I wonder if this archive can move so seamlessly from where it's imagined to be located to be performed on stage? And when it comes to the stage, what is the relationship between the performer and the spectator? The staging, if you will, of the truth claims of the pictorial object.
Well, thank you, Okwi, for that question, because I think your question goes straight to the crux of the matter. Of course, archival datum do not move seamlessly into the theatre. They are made to move. They are invoked, and they are produced as the scenario and the scenography in many senses. But my hunch is we can get a different kind of sensibility if, instead of thinking of how the archives moves into the theatre, we begin to think of how the theatre moves into the archive, which is to say that the production of archival traces itself has, to my understanding, a performative character and quality. That's why we were so struck when we saw this particular photograph, because it is clearly a stage set. There are elements to the scenario, there is an architectural backdrop, there are characters, there are 3 men and a horse, and then there are these bizarre panoply of props, which are these bones. And as you will recall from the text, the bones can't have been of the rebels whom they're supposed to represent. Forensically, they would have had to be of another set of people in order to be so aesthetically clean. I mean, they were clean bones, integrated skeletons. So in that sense, the staging of the photograph is itself a theatrical incident. And what we are doing is to recover the sense of the theater of the taking of this photograph in the archive and represent that as a theatrical performance. So it's, in a sense, a certain closing of a loop of performativity which the archival datum has in its inception, which is then revealed when it is produced on stage. And I think this is true of a lot of images of conflict, through the early histories of photography, where because of the limitations of the photographic apparatus itself, people had to stage or restage tableaus, in a sense, in order to get a sense of what was considered documentary truth. Any other questions or comments? Great. Then we go to the bar. Thank you. Thanks.